just the incredible surprise, shall I say, to put it gently, of finding a biological man, a 6'4" biological man in your locker room and having to accept that without being asked about it, without being told about it even. What was that like for you? Tell us about that.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Ms. Gaines, I want to start with you. Thank you for your courage in being here today. Thank you for your courage and advocacy for women. You have been subjected to an unbelievable amount of abuse. You talk about intimidation, threats of violence. You have suffered it. I want to put up here a picture so everybody can see it. This was the welcome you were treated to at San Francisco State University just a couple of months ago when a mob assembled where you were supposed to speak, I believe for over 3 hours, screamed, threatened you, barricaded you in a room. Do I have that basically correct?
Yes, I was held for ransom for 3.5 hours by hundreds of these protesters, as you see on the board. They demanded that I had to pay them money if I wanted to make it home to see my family safe again. The law enforcement in San Francisco, I respect, and I think law enforcement is what's brave, not me, and I respect all law enforcement, but the law enforcement I was met with in San Francisco, in my opinion, failed miserably in effectively doing their job. They had mentioned that it was not ideal for them to be seen as anything other than an ally to this community, and that was made very obvious in the treatment and effectiveness of removing me safely from that situation.
Why were you threatened and barricaded into a room and held for ransom for hours on end? I mean, what was it you were saying that was so terrible?
I was invited to speak on my experience of my senior year in competing against a male. Nothing opinionated about what I shared. It was sheerly the exact lived experience of what me and my teammates and fellow competitors dealt with. And so I spoke. After my speech, there was, of course, a lot of protesters in the room, which I'm totally fine with people protesting. It's their right to protest. But what I'm not fine with is when it does turn violent in the way that it did. Because protesters afterwards, they rushed into the room. They turned off the lights. They rushed to the front. Myself and others were assaulted, and that's ultimately when I was held for hostage for 3.5 hours.
This is unbelievable, unbelievable. Thank you for your courage in the midst of that. Let's talk a little bit about the message that you were sharing, and you started to talk about it in your opening statement. Just tell us about your experience, because nobody can question your experience. I don't think anybody sitting at the table, and certainly nobody at this podium, has had the experience that you have had. You were talking about just the incredible surprise, shall I say, to put it gently, of finding a biological man, a 6'4" biological man in your locker room and having to accept that without being asked about it, without being told about it even. What was that like for you? Tell us about that.
Again, we only became aware we would be undressing next to a man was when we had to see a man undressing while we were simultaneously undressing. And so I immediately left the locker room and I went up to one of the officials on the pool deck. And I said, what are the guidelines to allow a man into our locker room? I know the guidelines for the competition, but what are the guidelines for the locker room? And he so nonchalantly said back, oh, we actually got around this by making locker rooms unisex. And so I'm thinking to myself in these brief moments, first and foremost, you just admitted this is a male by acknowledging how you had to change your rules to make the locker rooms unisex. You acknowledge that we do not share the same sex, first and foremost. Secondly, unisex? Any man could have walked into our locker room, any coach, any official, any man who wanted to would have had full reins to, and bare minimum, we weren't forewarned about it. And that's the traumatizing part. Of course, the experience in and of the locker room itself is traumatizing, but I think for me, it was so easy for them to dismiss our rights to privacy. Senator Durbin, in your opening statement, you had mentioned this rhetoric. It's you had mentioned that what message does it send to trans individuals? And my combat to that is, what message does this send to women, to young girls who are denied of these opportunities? So easily their rights to privacy and safety thrown out of the window to protect a small population, protect one group as long as they're happy. What about us? That is the overall general consensus of how we all felt in that locker room.
Why do you think it is that the NCAA and so many people in power seem intent on just erasing your opinion, your views, the whole category of women? I noticed that recently you just posted this to social media about a message that Harvard was sending around, I think, to its swimmers, telling them, don't talk about Leah Thomas, don't share your opinions. If you get contacted by a member of the media, then refer that to the university. Don't say anything, for heaven's sake. Tell us about this. I mean, this has been your experience over and over and over. You're told as a woman to shut up, don't say anything. What's that like?
That is continually happening. And if we do speak up, you're immediately labeled as some name. They will call you everything under the sun, whether it's transphobic, homophobic, racist, white supremacist, domestic terrorist. They will throw them all at you in hopes to deter you, in hopes to silence you. Leah Thomas's teammates, they were forced every single week to go to mandatory LGBTQ education meetings to learn about how just by being cisgender, they were oppressing Leah Thomas. They were told that they're not allowed to take a stance because their school has already taken their stance for them. They were told that you will never get a job, you will never get into grad school, you will lose your friends, you will lose your scholarship and playing time if you speak out. They told these girls that if you do speak out, and any harm whatsoever comes towards Thomas's way, whether that's through social media, whether that's physical, mental, emotional harm, then you are solely responsible, and you could be responsible for a potential death. And you don't want that, do you? Of course not. Who would ever want to be responsible in a potential death? But that is the emotional blackmail that is plaguing this country, especially in universities.
Last question, and I'll ask this and then give you a chance to respond, and I'm done with this, Mr. Chairman. Let me give you a chance to respond to something that Leah Thomas said recently, publicly. She said this publicly. They're using, this quote now, they're using the guise of feminism, they meaning you, using the guise of feminism to sort of push transphobic beliefs, meaning you advocating for women, women's rights, is actually just a cover for transphobia. Do you want to respond to that?
Feminism is not a fluid term. The original and the meaning of what it means to be a feminist is to uphold, respect, honor, embrace, and celebrate women on our own physical ceilings, our own uniqueness. That term has not changed. And what this really is a male mansplaining what it is to be a feminist, which I honestly think is pretty ironic, and it's something we've seen before.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Cruz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Title IX was a landmark civil rights law. It helped create the incredible breadth of women's sports and girls' sports that we see across the country. I believe in girls' sports. I believe in women's sports. I'm the proud father of 2 daughters who are both athletes. I think participating in competitive sports is a wonderful thing for a young girl. I think it is a wonderful thing for a woman. And I think, unfortunately, today's Democrat Party has decided that women's sports and girls' sports no longer matters, and they're willing to push radical legislation designed to destroy girls' sports and women's sports. Ms. Gaines, I want to thank you for your courage. You are relatively young, but you have demonstrated incredible courage. And because you have dared to speak up, you have been demonized, you have been vilified. I saw when you were attacked by a leftist mob at San Francisco State University for daring to speak up. You had an incredible record as a swimmer at the University of Kentucky. You were a 2-time NCAA All-American. You were a 5-time SEC champion. You're an SEC record holder and a 2-time Olympic trial qualifier. But yet on March 27th, 2022, something changed. What happened on March 17th, 2022?
That's when Thomas and I raced in the 200 freestyle and again resulted in a tie.
And so you tied. What was the consequence of tying?
We went behind the awards podium where typically you're handed your trophy, you're marched out, you're named an All-American. And so we go back there, and the official looks at both Thomas and myself and says, "Great job, but you guys tied. And we only have 1 trophy, therefore we're giving this trophy to Leah." And I question this, and I say, why? And at first, I shortened it in my testimony, but really he stumbled on his words. He didn't know how to answer this. And at first he's, well, we're just doing this in chronological order. To which I further pressed, and I said, okay, well, what are you being chronological about? Because we tied. And if we're doing this off alphabetical order, G comes before T, so what are you being chronological about? To which this wasn't a script they had prepared for him. And he actually appreciated his honesty. He did say, we have to give the trophy for Leah because Leah has to have it for pictures. They've made that clear. Leah has to have the trophy for pictures. You can pose with this trophy, but you have to give yours back. You have to go home empty-handed. Leah Thomas takes the trophy home, end of story.
Now, let me ask you, as someone who's competed at the elite level, in your experience, is there a difference between women and men?
Of course. I think we learned this at a very young age, watching even 12 and unders play. Going through puberty causes irreversible advantage, that no matter the training, no matter the diet, no matter any alterable change you can make, will overcome that male advantage. Especially in sports like swimming, where lung capacity matters so much. Even something as silly as throat size, men have on average a 40% larger throat, which sounds like it's nothing, but when you're grasping for air, that 40% larger throat makes a huge difference in athletic success, not to mention height. You guys know the differences.
Ms. Robinson, do you agree with Ms. Gaines that there's a difference between women and men?
If the question is about trans women,
I'm just asking, is there a difference between women and men?
I mean, what I can say is that the NCAA has rules in place. They've had rules in place for the last decade, and when this competition
I'm
happened,
going to try again.
the rules were clear.
Do you believe there's a difference between women and men? It's a yes/no question. Do you believe there's a difference?
Oh, I think that we're talking about this case with the NCAA.
No, I'm asking a question. Do you believe there's a difference between women and men? Most people could answer this very simply. I'm curious if you're willing to do so.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just putting it into the context of the conversation that we're having. I think that there are definitions related to sex.
Is
but
that
I
a
also
yes?
think
So I'm
that
trying to
when
get a yes or no. I'm not trying to get a speech.
Is
there a difference between women and men?
I think that there are definitions for biological sex.
Okay, so you're
which
not
is
answering
different
that.
than
Let me ask
gender.
you this question then. Why do women's sports exist? If you can't define a difference between women and men, why not abolish women's sports and just tell little girls to swim with little boys and see who wins?
Oh, I'm simply saying that that sex is
My
different
question,
than gender.
why
and I do believe
why
that
do
women's sports have a great
exist?
value. I mean, Senator, I'll tell you right
Ms.
now.
Robinson, please answer the question I'm asking you.
Absolutely.
Why do women's sports exist?
I think that there are so many positive benefits to sports.
But
I mean,
why have a
we've talked
separate
about it here
category for
today.
women? If there's no difference between women and men, why to have women's sports?
I'm saying that there's a difference between sex and gender, and that the NCAA has rules in place, which they have for the last decade.
Mr. Chairman,
which
I would
determine
like
that
to enter into
related
the
to
record an
participation.
article from Duke Law called Comparing Athletic Performances for the Best Elite Women to Boys and Men. And it goes through examining in 2017 the top records for women in the world in various track and field events. So, for example, in the 100-meter, the top record for women in the world was 10.71 seconds. Now, that record for the number one woman in the world in 2017 was, in the year 2017, broken by 124 boys under 18. In that same year, the record for the number one competing woman in the 100-meter dash in the world was broken by a total of 2,474 men. If the radical Democrat agenda to destroy girls' sports and women's sports succeeds, little girls will not have a chance to compete. So I ask unanimous consent that this article be entered into the record.
Without objection. Senator Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses here today. Ms. Robinson, I want to follow up by trying to understand your answer to one of Senator Cruz's questions. And this is really a question, not a suggestion. Do I understand your position to be that there are two sexes, but there can be more than two genders?
I wouldn't even say two, and we've got Dr. Lopez here as well, but there's also the definition of intersex. I think that often in these conversations we're conflating sex and gender, and I do want to affirm here that trans women are women. That is their gender.
Okay, but I'm trying to understand. Do you make a distinction between sex and gender?
Yes, sir.
Okay, explain that. Do you think there are more than two sexes?
I believe that there's a definition for intersex as well that I want to acknowledge. But sex is assigned
so
at birth.
Three? I'm just trying to understand. I'm thoroughly confused. So you're born, I'm talking about biology, male, female, and what else?
I believe that intersex is also acknowledged.
Intersex.
But again, I'm not a doctor here. What I can
And
say
what does intersex mean?
is that there's a difference between sex and gender. And I think in these conversations, we're conflating the two.
Well, but I want to start with sex, okay? There's male, there's female. When a baby's born, before the baby has had time to even have a sense of self, there's male, female, and intersex. There's a third sex.
I believe that is true, but I would defer to Dr. Lopez as I'm not a physician.
Okay. And how many genders are there?
I think the gender is expansive, and the definitions are always growing. Today I can tell you,
More
I talk
than
to young
five?
people
More
that
than-
talk about non-binary as
More than 5?
I think the gender is not a binary, is what I'm trying
But
to say.
are there more than 5 genders? I'm just trying to understand. Are there more than 5 genders?
Well, I mean, I think that there was a time where women wearing pants didn't feel like it was appropriate for their gender, and yet I'm wearing pants today.
If
I
you
think
could
that there are
just
ways
answer
that
my
we
question.
express our
Are there
gender
more
that
than
are
5
expansive.
genders? Are there more than 5?
I wouldn't subject myself to naming how many genders there are, but what I can say is
there
that
an
gender is a
infinite number?
reflection. Excuse me?
There's an infinite number of genders?
I think depending on your culture, there are a lot of different genders that exist. And I can also say that it's a term that's evolving. If you look at young people today, they really don't lean into the binary of only woman and man. So I think that it's incumbent upon us not to legislate on this, but create space for them to explore what their identities are, what their gender identities are.
Let's get back to athletics. I think I understand what you're saying. There are 3 sexes, male, female, and intersex.
I believe that to be true, but again, I'm not a physician.
And
so
there are an infinite number of genders because gender is a mental state.
Gender is about expression, and I think that there are a variety of ways that you can express your gender.
Okay, so there's infinite number. All right, let's go back to the biology. Male, female, boy, girl. Okay, biologically, do males have an advantage over females biologically in sports?
Again, I'm not a physician, and I can't speak to that.
What's your real world experience?
It depends. I mean, there are some people who are born male that I'm faster than if I were to sprint against them, and some that I'm not. Some males
So
that are
you don't
taller than
believe
some
that-
women,
you
and
don't
some that are
believe
shorter.
that a biological male has a physical advantage in sports over a biological female?
Not as a definitive statement.
Give me an example. Well, no, I don't think. How many female members of the NBA do you see?
Well, I can say that, there's been this news article about men that think that they could beat Serena Williams in tennis, right? That they think that they could actually score a point on her. And it's just not the case. She is stronger than that.
What's your experience, Ben? Male, female.
Both Serena and Venus lost to the 203rd ranked male tennis player, which they're phenoms for women. My experience, my husband, he swam at University of Kentucky as well. In terms of accolades and in terms of national ranking, I was a much better swimmer than him. He could kick my butt any day of the week without trying.
Okay. I just think, Ms. Robinson, I'm trying to understand where you're coming from. I think you lose a lot of credibility when you don't concede that a biological male has physical advantages over a biological female. I mean, I just think that's a proven fact, and you really hurt your credibility. I understand you want the world to be a better place. I do too, and I don't think people ought to be discriminated against because of an immutable characteristic. I don't. And I think that I think everybody ought to be free to be themselves. And what you do in your bedroom or what I do in my bedroom with a consenting adult is nobody's business. But if what I do in my bedroom with a consenting adult, if I decide I want to tell somebody's child about it, then other people have rights too. And I think parents have rights. And I think biological females have rights to be able to compete fairly in sport, in sports. So I really think you hurt your credibility when you refuse to acknowledge that biological males have an advantage over biological females. It kind of makes me wonder about all your testimony. Thank you,
Senator
Mr. Chairman.
Kennedy. I'm sorry, go ahead.
What I'm trying to say is that there is not a definitive advantage in all cases. Sir, I don't know if you believe that you could beat Serena Williams in tennis, but I probably think that that's not the case. There are not all cases where all men are physically superior to all women. And at the end of the day, in this conversation, we're not talking about that. We're talking about trans women who are, in fact, women, who deserve to play in a gender that matches their sports, who deserve all the benefits that Ms. Gaines is talking about. And as a cisgender black woman, I can say definitively that my womanhood is not threatened by a transgender person asserting hers as well.